Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we're going to be reviewing every single studio album from American Metal Crusaders' Lamb of God. Realistically, I probably should have put this up shortly before or after the Omens album review, but fuck it, it doesn't always work out that way. At least I'm finally getting to it. I said I would, and here I am, doing it, because I'm a man of my word. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As per the norm with these reviewing every album style videos, I am not interested in EPs, demos, live albums, or compilations. I will be looking at everything from New American Gospel all the way to 2020's self-titled record. I will not be talking about Omens because we literally just did the review for that album like a week ago. Just go watch that. I don't really feel like repeating myself. We're also, just for shits and giggles, going to include the Burn the Priest material, because why not? It's basically the same fucking band. I will be talking about each album in order of release and assigning each a score out of 5, 5 being the best, 0 being the worst. With that out of the way, now that everything is hopefully clear, let's start off. Let's start reviewing every Lamb of God album. Fuck yeah! First up, we have Burn the Priest, released in April 1999 via Legion Records. For those unaware, there was a period when Lamb of God performed not under the name Lamb of God, but under the name Burn the Priest, and they were also a slightly more extreme band. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of snappy breakdowns and groovy riffs here that would not be out of place on As the Palaces Burn or Sacrament or something like that, but, you know, also, this thing has, like, way more death metal and hardcore influence. The opening track, Bloodletting, is, like, dangerously close to being a full-blown death grind track, in my opinion. I mean, it's just really intense and has this insanely fast pace to it. A very young Randy Blythe is letting out a slew of blood-curdling screams and roars. The guitars are very thick, very crusty, covered in mud. And this thing also lacks the intricacy and the politically charged lyricism that can sometimes be found on a Lamb of God record. I mean, these guys are pissed off, but they're not really pissed off about anything in particular. They're just kind of pissed off for the sake of being pissed off. Which, you know, fine, because I dig it. The aforementioned Bloodletting, great track. Goatfish is also a great track. Salivation is also a great track. Dimera, great track. With 14 songs, an argument could be made that it's a little long, even though the album wraps up in about 40 minutes. I would also argue, legit, that the album is a little repetitive, a little one-dimensional. You're not seeing as much variety and as much flexibility here as you would see on an actual Lamb of God record. But I mean, the riffs and the beats are consistently really fucking tight. I love the really raw, crispy sound here. I would honestly give this a very enthusiastic 3 to 5. If you're looking for just the gnarliest beats and the gnarliest riffs, you're not interested in anything else, like you just want your shit and you want to go home, this is it. This is for you. More power to you. I think you'll really dig this. It was definitely interesting to revisit this record. This is an album I've never previously spent a lot of time with, and I was interested to see that there's actually more of what defines Lamb of God in this than I remember. That's pretty cool. That's pretty neat. Next up, we have New American Gospel, released in September 2000 via Prosthetic Records. This would be Lamb of God's official debut album under the name Lamb of God. It keeps the brutal elements of Burn the Priest intact, but it is also a tighter and a more refined record. The hooks are bigger, the grooves are better. I think the production does suffer a little bit, like it's kind of raw and tinny, maybe too much so for its own good at times, but there's also something like slightly charming and endearing about this very unpolished side of Lamb of God. Like, it actually does go a bit of a way in emphasizing, like, just how young and angry these fucking guys are. I mean, the piss is foul. The vinegar is foul. It doesn't get much more piss and vinegar than this. Moonshine, too. My God, this thing just reeks. I can't help but wonder how kids must have felt listening to this in 2000, because it's just so much different from everything else being released at the time. I mean, it's way heavier, it's still really anthemic, back-to-back bangers for days, Letter to the Unborn, Black Label, The Black Dahlia, The Subtle Arts of Murder and Persuasion, A Warning. I mean, there are just so many big, bouncy, filthy fucking grooves and riffs. Randy still sounds fucking awesome. Duh. Solid 3.5 out of 5 for me. It's way more bare bones than I remember, but like, fuck it. It holds up really fucking well. It's just a really fun, gnarly, kind of groovy death metal, metalcore record with banging riffs and banging beats and just all around fucking awesome shit. Next up, we have As the Palaces Burn, released in May 2003, once again via Prosthetic Records. This builds on everything that was so successful about New American Gospel, and simply adds more riffs, more grooves, some melodic tones and guitar licks and such, a very raw, kind of unpolished sound and vibe, courtesy of Devin Townsend, weirdly, of all fucking people. There's a collaboration you don't see very often. Everything that you know and love about Lamb of God is pretty much defined on this album as well. Like, you're starting to see some of Randy's, like, wild, extreme vocal inflections and growls. You're starting to hear more of the crispy, crunchy southern tone. Chris Adler is starting to throw in some more technical bits and pieces in the percussion while still bringing in tons of dumb, bouncy grooves. Like, these guys are just so much more confident and so much more excited. It shows consistently through the thing, and it results in some awesome material. Vigil holds up, The 11th Hour, the title track, As the Palaces Burn, Purified, Fear Malice, A Devil in God's Country, which to this day, honestly, might still be one of my favorite Lamb of God tracks. There's just something so urgent and provocative about the entire album, but this track in particular, it's just really great. I feel like lyrically it's aged really well, too. On this one, I'm feeling a 4 out of 5. I think this is a great record. I think it holds up really well. I think it's one of Lamb of God's best albums still to this day. And if you haven't checked it out, if for whatever reason, definitely do so. Also, if someone wants to get this for me on vinyl and then send it to me, pay for it in its entirety, that would be great. Please and thank you. I love you. Let's see what you can do, all right? I believe in you. You got this. Next up, we have Ashes of the Wake, released in August 2004 via Prosthetic and Epic Records. And we have arrived, ladies and gentlemen, at what I feel is Lamb of God's best album to date. They've basically just taken everything that worked about the previous records, refined it big time, and at the same time, they've also kind of ironed out the kinks, and they figured out the things that don't work, and they've either made them work or removed them altogether. For instance, the production of, the last few records has been kind of hit and miss, bits that I appreciate, but overall could be a lot better. This is not the case. I love the sound of this. I love how full-bodied it is. I love how juicy and fucking, like, massive everything feels. It's still got that really crispy, crunchy southern tone, but there's real body to everything. Everything is really crisp and transparent and punchy. The grooves are absolutely infectious on this thing. The hooks are massive. The riffs are fucking awesome. It's just banger after motherfucking banger here. Like, Laid to Rest is still one of my favorite Lamb of God songs after all these years. One of the best album openers, honestly, on any metal record. Plus, like, Blood of the Scribe, The Faded Line, the title track, Ashes of the Wake, Now You've Got Something to Die For. Tons of explosive shotgun-style bursts of, like, insane vocal work from Randy Blythe, sounding his best here. Not just vocally, but, like, also lyrically. This is a very poignant and a very urgent record. The album is very dark and introspective at times, in a very somber, sobering kind of way. It also deals heavily with the events of the Iraq War in the early 2000s, which at that point had just kind of started up. Ashes of the Wake goes as far as to include snippets from, former Marine Staff Sergeant Jimmy Massey in an interview after his return from the Iraq War. It's still their best-selling record. The aforementioned Laid to Rest is actually their most popular song on Spotify. This is commonly ranked as being one of the best metal albums of the 2000s, and it's very easy to see why, because it's fucking great. It's fucking fantastic. Honestly, I'm feeling a 4.5 out of 5 on this. I think it's incredible. I think it has held up remarkably well over the years. For me, it really just doesn't get better than this. Ashes of the Wake is Lamb of God at their most important, at their heaviest, at their best in terms of songwriting and production. It's their best album, period. And I won't hear any arguments otherwise. Check it out if you haven't already. Next up, we have Sacrament, released August 2006 via Prosthetic and Epic Records. Once again, this thing's pretty good. Not as strong as the Palaces Burn, and especially not as strong as Ashes of the Wake, but it does have plenty of fucking highlights. Some of Lamb of God's most iconic fucking material can be found on here. And even some of the deeper cuts, you know, still plenty of tasty riffs, still plenty of tasty jams. My issues with this record ultimately boil down to the album feeling slightly derivative of itself. Not bad, still fun, but definitely not as powerful as previous records. The production, too, I think, suffers a little bit. It is clear and punchy and crispy, but I don't know, it also feels like kind of muddy at times. It feels like it could be louder. It feels like it could be more dynamic. I feel like Randy's vocals kind of swallow everything at times, and there's also something about the vocal tone itself that's a little off. Almost like there's a muzzle on him, and he's kind of got it halfway off, but not fully off. I don't know, it's an odd mix. Not a horrible mix, but an odd mix, and it does kind of hurt some of these songs. But even despite that, you have Walk With Me in Hell, which is still an awesome fucking song. You also have Redneck, which will continue to inspire me to just go absolutely apeshit every time I hear it. There's also Again We Rise, Blacken the Cursed Sun, Foot to the Throat. It's not as impactful, it's not as provocative or as urgent or as violent, but I mean, it's still pretty much a lot of those things, you know? It's all good, it's all fun, it's all very well made, very well performed. I'm feeling a solid 3.5 out of 5 on this record. From what I understand, this is Metal Trench's least favorite album. I can understand why, but honestly, I think there are enough, like, super great gnarly jams on this thing to recommend. It's not Lamb of God's most consistent album, but the stuff that does hits pretty goddamn hard. Next up, we have Raph, released February 2009 via Epic and Roadrunner Records. This is the first time that Lamb of God would collaborate with producer Josh Wilbur, and most certainly not the last. I feel like Josh Wilbur is a guy who perfectly understands what Lamb of God needs. He just doesn't fully understand it on this record. I feel like right off the bat, the mix and the sound is really loud, like, oh my fucking god. But the album itself is still pretty cool. It's got some thrashier tones and vibes, which I really dig. Like, you know, Set It Off, for instance, which is just basically a thrash metal bruiser, albeit with some, like, groove metalcore spices here and there. At this point, though, I do feel very comfortable just straight up calling Lamb of God a groove metal band. I mean, there are still other flavors and things going on, but, like, I mean, just listen to Broken Hands, just listen to Grace. It's pretty goddamn clear. Tracks like Grace, Everything to Nothing, Choke, Sermon find a nice sweet spot in between the thrash and the groove. I'm really loving the closing track, Reclamation. It had honestly been a long time since I had listened to this track, and it's way darker and way more progressive than I remember. Like, it goes through a lot of different phases and has a lot of different riffs and sections, and I really dig that. I'm feeling a strong 3.5 out of 5 on this. There are some cookie cutter moments here and there that hold it back, as well as the mix being kind of glaringly loud at times. But, you know, it's still filled with tons of great fucking songs. I don't really see people talking about this the same way they talk about Ashes of the Wake and As the Palaces Burn, which is a shame, honestly, because I think there's some really good material on here. Next up, we have Resolution, released in June 2012 via Epic and Roadrunner. Once again, this album's alright. This album was my introduction to Lamb of God, so I kind of figured that when returning to it, I would be more head over heels in love with it. Honestly, I find myself not liking it as much as I remember. Still some good shit, though. Like, Desolation is a pretty spicy, hefty, muscular number. Ghost Walking is awesome. It's got that really catchy fucking chorus. It's got those really gnarly fucking grooves. It's got that, like, really rustic, raw, kind of creepy acoustic intro that adds so much atmosphere. The closing track, King Me, is still one of the most evocative and emotionally charged things I've heard from Lamb of God. I love how angular the riffs are. I love how punishing it is. I love the use of clean vocals and like more cinematic elements and soundscapes. The opening cut, Straight for the Sun, too. Fucking gnarly. Like, I want to hear Lamb of God do a full-blown fucking like NOLA sludge metal record after hearing Straight for the Sun. It is super wicked fucking heavy. The sound mix on this record, I think, is fucking fantastic. Like, from a sonic perspective, like, just looking at the production, this is maybe one of Lamb of God's best records, right up there with Ashes of the Wake. Unfortunately, the material kind of in the middle of all this just isn't doing as much for me. It's not horrible. It's still pretty good. There's still plenty of crunchy riffs and, you know, all the beats and the screams that you know and love, but like, man, it is not hitting nearly as hard as the tracks we've mentioned. It's a very heavy-handed record in that sense. Like, it starts off and ends with its best moments, and then everything in the middle is fine, but like, I could probably do without. Like, honestly, with the exception of Undertow, Cheated, and Terminally Unique, I find myself skimming past a good chunk of everything from Ghost Walking to King Me. The album is also definitely too long, with 14 songs clocking in at just under an hour. You could probably remove, like, at least 3, and you would immediately have something a lot more impactful. I'm going to go with a very, 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 very enthusiastic 3 out of 5. The stuff that's great is still great. Everyone sounds awesome. It amazes me how much more expressive and how much more dynamic Randy gets as a vocalist with each album. I will happily revisit Ghost Walking and King Me and all that, but like, I don't really care about the rest of this album, you know? Like, there's half the songs are great, or at least good, and the other half are fine and kind of forgettable. And that's not great. That's not awesome. Thankfully, the good stuff is good enough that I still feel comfortable with my 3 out of 5. The production is great. The performances are great. You know, not a perfect record, but still some good, solid bangers here and there. Next up, we have 7, Sturm und Drang, released July 2015 via Epic and Nuclear Blast Records. And this is a very interesting record for a number of reasons. First off, in some ways, it is a slightly more experimental record, pairing everything that Lamb of God have kind of done over the past decade, and bringing in some clean vocals, and also bringing in collaborators like Chino Moreno from the Deftones, and Greg Puciato from the Dillinger Escape Plan, both of whom appear on the tracks Embers and Torches respectively, and both these songs are great, both these guys do a great job, I dig them, they're cool. More importantly, though, this is the first album that Lamb of God released following Randy Blythe's manslaughter case. Yeah, I bet y'all forgot about that one. For those of you unaware, this was a court case in the Czech Republic stemming from a 2010 Lamb of God concert in Prague, wherein 19-year-old fan Daniel Nosek sustained head injuries leading to a coma and death. According to a verdict delivered by the municipal court in Prague on May 5, 2013, it was proven that Blythe had thrown Nosek off stage and thus had moral responsibility for his death. However, due to the circumstances, Blythe was not held criminally liable. Most of the blame lay with promoters and security members. The acquittal was upheld by the Prague High Court on June 5th, 2013. So, yeah, that's kind of a lot to go through, and that has definitely influenced a lot of what happens on this record. For instance, the opening track, Still Echoes, actually deals with the history of the prison in which Randy was held, and also deals with his own experiences staying there. The song 512 goes even further, referencing the number of the cell that Randy was held in, and it also deals with how he feels he was mentally shaped and changed by his experience in prison. Now, not every single song on this album deals with Randy's time in prison or the manslaughter case and trial, but, you know, in general, it does feel like, you know, this whole incident just gave Lamb of God a real kick in the ass. The grooves are super tight. Everything is really brutal, really powerful. Lamb of God was clearly paying a lot of attention to the world around them, as well as to what was happening to them internally, as well as what was happening to Randy specifically, and they used all of that as ammunition for a legitimately pretty ass-kicking record. I would argue there's a bit of a dip in the very middle, and I would also argue that the production could also just be punchier. But, you know, all things considered, solid 3.5 out of 5 on this bad boy. These guys went to a lot of dark places for inspiration. They brought in enough new elements to make their iconic sound feel fresh and interesting. They sound hungry, they sound angry, they sound pissed off. They've got something to prove on this record, and for the most part, it works out. They've made their point, they have proven it. Good for them. It's honestly a really good record. Probably their best record in the 2010s. Next up, we have Legion XX, released May 2018 via Epic and Nuclear Blast Records. This was actually released under the name Burn the Priest and is also a cover album. This gives Lamb of God an opportunity to play with a lot of the ideas that have previously informed their sound. You know, they're paying tribute to hardcore punk, to thrash metal, to a lot of crossover music, to industrial music and alternative rock. Covering stuff from SOD, Agnostic Front, Ministry, The Cro-Mags, The Accused, and many, many more. There's some big hits like Eye Against Eye, originally by Bad Brains, Jesus Built My Hot Rod, originally from Ministry, and they do pretty faithful, respectful jobs there. They're fine. I think some of the deeper cuts are actually some of the better ones on here. Like their cover of Honey Bucket from the Melvins is really great. Their cover of Dine-Alone from Quicksand is really great. There's a lot of enthusiasm here. These guys are clearly having a lot of fun just playing some of their favorite songs from some of their favorite bands, and that adds a lot to the overall vibe of this thing. The production is polished, but it also kind of carries the spirit of like an underground kind of hardcore or alternative record from the late 80s or early 90s. So yeah, I guess Lamb of God, or rather Burn the Priest, did the impossible. They made a cover album that I actually kind of like. It's not amazing, but it's well made. It's fun. And I think I would give it an enthusiastic 3 out of 5, leaning towards a 3.5 out of 5. If you love Lamb of God and you're looking for something a little different, and you also kind of want to see what bands specifically inform their one-of-a-kind sound, I would say definitely check this out because it's fun and cool. And then also check out all of the bands that are, you know, being paid homage to on the album. You know, go check out SOD and Cro-Mags, because it's fucking awesome. And finally, this brings us to the band's self-titled album, Lamb of God, released in June 2020 via Epic and Nuclear Blast Records. I honestly don't have a ton to say about this. It's lame. It's boring. It's predictable. Very cookie cutter. I'm not a fan. I don't hate it, but I don't love it. It's an album. It exists. That's the most positive thing I have to say about it. This would be the band's first album with Art Cruz on drums. This would also be their first original album in 5 years under the name Lamb of God. And I feel like this is the point where age is starting to get to Lamb of God. I feel like they're kind of phoning it in on this. It's just not as heavy. It's not as tight. The songs aren't as strong. They aren't as catchy. They aren't as punchy. They aren't as groovy. There are some more guest stars who helped provide a little bit of additional spice. You know, Jamie Josta from Hatebreed pops up. Chuck Billy from Testament pops up. But other than that, this is a very paint-by-numbers kind of Lamb of God record. It just feels like we're microwaving leftovers from 2 or 3 albums ago, and I don't really feel like there's as much passion and fire being really put into it. Memento Mori is fine. Roots featuring the aforementioned Chuck Billy is fine. Everyone still sounds okay. Like Randy Blythe, even when he's not given 110%, is still a really good singer. The riffs are still good. Art Cruz doing his best to fill in for Chris Adler, an iconic drummer. But yeah, the songwriting just isn't there. The songs just don't hit. Not at all, really. Not consistently. In the Omens review, I said that I would probably give this self-titled album a 2.5 out of 5 if I were to review it now. Honestly, sitting here talking about it, I'm feeling a 2. Like, I don't know, man. I mean, it's not a harmful or offensive record. It's not horrible, but like, goddamn, it's just kind of boring. It's so generic. It's so predictable. And it's not even like fun. Like, at least, you know, when we go back to Slayer, at least with something like Christ Illusion, it's got like intensity and like there's an energy to it that is interesting and captivating. This has nothing. This is Lamb of God's Repentless. This is their World Painted Blood. They're just like really fucking phoning it in and doing what's expected of them and putting really nothing into it. Their weakest riffs, their weakest hooks, their weakest everything. And since we're not going to talk about Omens, because I literally just reviewed it less than a week ago, I think that brings an end to reviewing every Lamb of God album. So now it's your turn to tell me, what's their best album? What's their worst album? What are their best songs? What are their worst songs? How would you rate every individual album? How would you rank each album altogether? You know, what's S tier? What's B tier? What's F tier? What's lower than F tier? Is there anything lower than F tier? It's your turn to tell me. It's your turn to let me know. Look at that! Omens. Look at that! Something else. I don't know what. Look at this! The subscribe button. Wow, isn't that cool? Press it and have a fantastic fucking day, ladies and gentlemen.